And okay, so welcome everyone to the second day of 80 Years and Beyond, a virtual symposium on Canadian comics. My name is Candida Rifkind. I'm a professor in the English department at the University of Winnipeg. And just for future reference for the rest of the day, I'm going to put the conference program with all the links for every other session in the chat. And as the slide says, I'm going to take it down in a minute. There is closed captioning available, and all of the sessions are being recorded and will be available shortly after the symposium ends. Registered participants will receive an email with that information, as well as a follow-up survey about this event. Okay. Just got to pull out more screens. Okay. So I want to begin today with a land acknowledgement. I'm coming to you today from Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is on Treaty 1 territory and located on the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. I also want to recognize and honor Treaty 3, and in particular Shoal Lake 40 First Nation, as the source of Winnipeg's clean drinking water. I encourage you, wherever you are, to find out about the land and the water you drink. I also encourage you to read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action, especially those that apply to education, museums, and archives. And I'm posting that link in the chat right now. So yesterday at the conference, we focused on the past and history of Canadian comics and how we tell that story. Sorry. And also issues of archives and librarianship in collecting, preserving, and disseminating that history. Today, the symposium turns to the present and maybe even the future, talking about contemporary comics and with contemporary cartoonists. So to save time, I'm going to paste the bios of both of our distinguished keynotes into the chat. And you can also go to the conference website, as I mentioned, and see all of the conference presenters' bios. And my chat isn't working, so I'll get that going once they start talking. But I think we'll just jump straight to it. This session is scheduled to end at 12 o'clock Eastern. So since we started a bit late and we have a half-hour break, I think we can go over a bit if our presenters don't mind. And we hadn't actually talked about what order we're going to go in, but since it's very early for Cole and AC just got here, which one of you would like to go first and just bite the bullet?
Cole, you want to take the floor? You want me to take it? It doesn't matter to me, brother.
Are we just doing introductions?
Yeah, so if you can talk for a few minutes about your work and your practice, and I think we'd schedule about 10 to 15 minutes for each of you to tell us about yourself and your work, and then we'll get to some questions I have, and then we'll open it up to the floor for a Q&A. I should mention that anyone who has comments or questions, please use the chat function in Zoom to post those. You can also use the raise hand during the Q&A to ask your question directly. But we'll start with presentations by both of our guests. So take it away, Cole.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you. Hi, everybody. It's nice to meet you all. I'm excited to share this internet stage with Hoche. Yeah, so I'm Cole Pauls. I'm a Teltan comic artist, printmaker, and illustrator from Haines Junction, Yukon. I went to Emily Carr going on 6 years ago was when I graduated. I teach zines as kind of a day job at schools, and I'm working on my third book right now, Quandar, which means story in Southern Shoshone. And it's published by Conundrum Press next fall. And yeah, it's just going to collect all my like 1 or 2 page comics that I've had in the Globe and Mail and Root and Stem magazine. Yeah, I'm pretty excited for that book to come out next year, and I've just been plugging away at it. I guess all fall now that it's like pissing rain outside. There's nothing else to do but draw. Yeah.
Pissing rain and pissing COVID.
Well, before I hand it over, can you just tell us a little bit for those who don't know about Dakwakata Warriors, because that has really been your kind of breakout hit, and now you have Pizza Punks, and maybe just tell us a bit about Southern Shoshone and how that works in the comic, because I think a lot of people are interested in that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So Dakota Warriors was my first graphic novel. It's bilingual, so it has English and Southern Shoshone in it. Um, it's about these two native Power Rangers that are they're a wolf and crow, and they fight against an evil pioneer and a cyborg Sasquatch. Um,
Badass.
yeah, I did 3 issues of it, and Conundrum Press released the collection 2 Septembers ago now. And yeah, Pizza Punks is my other comic strip. That was mostly in art school, but I did a 5th issue just for the collection. So there's new comics in the book. But yeah, and I use a lot of Southern Shoshone in my comics to kind of reclaim indigenous space in the comic scene, just because there's been so many decades of misrepresentation of indigenous people in all media, but especially comics. So incorporating uh, my hometown's language into my work, I used a website called the Yukon Native Language Center, and I also have a couple uh, language preservers I can contact, and I've known them my whole life, or I should say, they've known me my whole life, because they've known me since I was like an infant, um, and they're very helpful. Vivian Smith and Kashaw, yeah. So between uh, the internet and the people I can rely on, I write all my Southern Shoshone in my comics through that.
And have you been surprised by the success of Dakwakata Warriors?
Oh yeah, it is. It's kind of nice because like I wrote it for Yukon youth, and just for like Yukoners in general. But I think the how accessible the comic is and how easy it is to pick it up and get a grasp of Yukon and Southern Shoshone culture, is what really like boosted the popularity, I think, because it's not just like it was drawn for Yukoners, but it's not just for Yukoners, if that makes sense.
And sorry, allergies. I also was wondering about, you're in Vancouver, right? And we tend to think of the Canadian comic scene as very Toronto based, not least because of TCAF, but also because we tend to always, gravitate towards there. As someone in Winnipeg, that annoys me no end. But I was wondering how you see yourself as a Vancouver artist or a Yukon artist in relationship to that kind of idea that Toronto is the center for Canadian comics.
Yeah, I not living in Toronto, I see that a lot too. Being in Vancouver, and like a Canadian comic show will be announced, and 9 out of 10 artists are Toronto artists, and there might be like 1 or 2 people from out of town. Um, so I guess where do I see myself? I would consider myself a Vancouver artist because I've lived here for almost 9 years now. Um, but all my comics and subject matter are almost exclusively about the Yukon. Um, and I definitely have a place back home too. So I guess it's both. A lot of people ask me like, what is it like being like the Yukon's comic artist? And I go, oh well, I'm not the artist. Like there's a bunch of other people there. Um, and I guess that's why we're here. We're here to celebrate other Canadian comics. Um, and when people ask me that question, I always go, "Oh, do you know Chris Cadwell? Do you know Doug Iroquois? Do you know like Kim Edgar and Dawson with Hectate Press?" Like there's a community of like comic strip people in the North that hasn't been really discussed in like Canadian comics. And They're really good, and I find them really fascinating, and I've been collecting them, and I have this big folder on my computer of like Inuit comic strips and Yukon comic strips. Um, and eventually I'm going to do a big write-up about like Northern representation in comics, because I don't feel like it's discussed a lot.
Maybe, Cole, can you sorry, send me those names and I'll put them in where you have a resource document with everything that people are mentioning, and I'll add them so that people can check out those artists, because I think they aren't really well known, especially in the South. One other question for you, it's about your style. So I've heard you talk before about your influences and your really distinctive and I think gorgeous style. So can you tell us a bit about where your style comes from and what your influences are?
Sure, yeah. Well, when I was 14, I took a trip down to Vancouver and I checked out the Vancouver Art Gallery. And on the way out, you go through the gift shop, and that's how I discovered Michael Nicole Yagalanis's work, because A Red a Haida manga had just came out when I was 14. And it blew my mind because it was like an indigenous comic, like a purely indigenous comic. And I had always wanted to see something like that, and I always wanted to make my own. And then seeing someone like they successfully did it, like it was a published book already, and it was like this gorgeous hardcover. Um, so that really like shaped my brain into being like, whoa, I could do this too. Um, but like as a kid, I was really into manga, like obsessed with like Shonen Jump and stuff like that. So um, I think like uh I'm most confident in black and white. And I think it's from like the sheer amount of like black and white comics I've absorbed in my life. I've kind of I've learned it's kind of like a crutch to me now, like I make a drawing, I fill in the blacks, and then I add some zipatone, and then I consider it done. Um, so yeah, like a lot of like black and white comics are a big influence on me too. And then like Gord Hill, obviously a huge influence on me. Um, if you have the Dakota Warriors book, he did a pinup in the back, and that's like the coolest thing ever. I bought the original off of him.
And do you see yourself within a kind of indigenous art tradition as well? Because you do use the form line, and Michael Nikolakalanis does really interesting things that actually Lorraine York has talked about in her presentation yesterday, with bending the line and breaking the comics grid. But, when I look at your work as an outsider, I do see a kind of West Coast, Pacific Northwest kind of indigenous form line working there. So I was just wondering if you could talk about your relationship to that really kind of iconic, almost gift shoppy idea of what West Coast and Yukon, Talton and Haida kind of visual culture looks like. Do you see yourself in that tradition, or are you trying to do something new?
Yeah, no, for sure. Like indigenous people, a lot of their art um has a lot of story to it, and we were like verbally like we were uh of like we spoke our stories vocally, and I just consider comics just another storytelling method. And it's kind of like a big deal to call yourself a storyteller in my culture, because then you're like the keeper of knowledge, and you have to like master learning these legends and stories, and you're supposed to be able to like retell them in the perfect cadence, and um like you kind of have like a high standard to call yourself a storyteller. So I guess I'll still call myself a comic artist, and if my community calls me a storyteller, then I'll accept it.
Okay, thanks so much, Cole. I think I'll leave it there, and then we'll have more general discussion and questions. And I'll turn it over to Hoche. Do you have slides you want to share?
I do not. I'm
Okay.
sorry to say.
No, that's cool.
I did put together a little opening statement that I thought you wanted us to tackle. I'm happy to leave that aside though and just.
No, that would be awesome. And I'll just drop some links to your works in the chat. I'll just also mention that The Beguiling has a special feature, and it's their banner right now for this symposium that links directly to works by Cole and Hoche for people to look at and buy. So I'll just hand it over to you, and maybe you can tell us a bit about your work and your background and whatever you've prepared.
Yeah, absolutely. Just want to say, first of all, thank you so much for the invite. Cole, it's an honor to be here with you. Ivan, nice to put a face to the email presence because we've been communicating for a little while. So my name is Hoche Anderson. I'm sorry guys, I'm one of those Toronto-based cartoonists that were being chided somewhat during Cole's speech. But yeah, that's who I am. Been in the game since around 1990. I started publishing comics with, I started working with a company called Vortex Comics initially out of Toronto. And then I got my first work published with Fantagraphics Books, who I've had an association with pretty much ever since. Started to branch out of strictly doing comics and got into the illustration world for a long time. Got into filmmaking, was a newspaper reporter for a while. So I've had a kind of a broad storytelling, experience, let us say, but it's always come down to, for me, being a visual storyteller, whether it's stuff on the screen or stuff on the page. It's telling stories through images that has always moved me the most. And trying to tell stories that are somewhat outside of the mainstream. I think there are a lot of, white, male, cis, hetero, all of that stuff. And that's all fantastic, but there are other voices out there as well. So I've always been interested in just trying to explore narratives that are outside of the general mainstream. That's kind of my story in a nutshell. So I had like a little thing that I wrote, just put together. Since I did it, I'll just throw it out there real quick and see how it lands. So Cole and myself have been asked to spend a few minutes, as I understood, talking about the state of Canadian comics today, which is a very tall order. And given my status as a practitioner rather than a pundit, not necessarily one that I think I'm up to. But so modern comics, for all intents and purposes, started either in the 1920s by gangsters like Meyer Lansky or Legs Diamond as a bootlegging front, or in the 1930s, when Max Gaines, the original EC publisher and father to Bill Gaines, had a brainstorm and decided to reprint the Sunday newspaper funnies in pamphlet form. Take whichever legend is the most sexy to you and run with that one. But by the Second World War, American comics weren't making their way to Canadian shores anymore due to the War Exchange Conservation Act, paving the way for a homegrown industry that came to be known as the Canadian Whites, which flourished until the fall of the Axis. During those years, and Ivan can speak more cogently about that than I can. During those years, when the only competition was amongst ourselves, our industry was able to find an identity of its own, if only for a few brief years. Now, I began my career in the 1980s, right here in Toronto, working for a Canadian publisher called Vortex Comics, as I mentioned. Publishing at the same time out of Montreal and somewhere else in Canada were Matrix Comics and Caliber Comics. So there was a little bit of a homegrown industry. But what I really liked about Vortex Comics was the fact that they focused outside of the superhero genre, and they were more about the cutting edge of what was possible in comic books at that time. So I came of age with the mindset that our talent and our publications didn't have to take a backseat to anybody. And that's an attitude I've maintained ever since. Because we've produced cartoonists like Hal Foster, like Todd McFarlane, like Seth, like Chester Brown, Ken Stacy, Julie Doucette, Paul Ravache, Adrian Dingle, Ramon K. Perez, Becca Kinsey, the list goes on and on. All right, so our work is world-class as far as I'm concerned. Publishers like Drawn and Quarterly and Lev Gleason Presents, formerly known as Chapter House, they've continued to set the high standard of publishing in Canada. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about the state of the industry today, but it's very difficult for me to do so just as a person who's churning out the work on a day-to-day basis. It's very difficult for me to kind of look up from my computer or from my drawing board to take stock of the industry as a whole. But But I guess if I had to say anything, it'd be that we're in as good a place as we can expect to be with the behemoth that is the United States, right above us, or right below us, I should say. We'll either we'll ever have to deal with its size, but we're never going to be less than what is produced down there. As far as I'm concerned, we produce the best cartoonist in the world, and will continue to do so. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Wow, that's an amazing kind of boost for, I think, a lot of people who feel, I don't know, what we might call a colonial cringe towards the US, that Canada isn't good enough. Can you tell us a little bit before we open it up about your style? Because some people describe your style as very cinematic. And of course, you are a filmmaker as well. And just maybe give us a sense of how you see your style maybe having shifted over your career, or even over the course of King, which once it came out as the complete edition is really interesting for readers, I think, to watch it go from the beginning to the end and see shifts in your style. But if that's too much, maybe just tell us where you think you're at now in terms of your comics and visual style.
Oh, wow. That's a tough question. It's very difficult to kind of step outside yourself and see your work objectively. I guess, yeah, I've always had an attraction to cinematic language, and that's definitely leached its way into my comic book work. Although as my career has kind of gone forward in both streams, I'm less and less interested in applying cinematic techniques to comics. I'm more and more interested in exploring what is unique only to comic books and trying to focus more on that. There's no point so much to me any longer in kind of cross-pollinating the two. But that's definitely there in the foundation for sure. I guess I'd have to describe my style really is kind of as restless, because I've always been very attracted to stuff that is very, for example, very photo referenced, but also stuff that is entirely cartoony. I'm very attracted to work that is line based exclusively, but also I love, picking up a brush and a tube of oil paint or acrylic paint and doing, a full color illustration. There's just such a broad variety of styles and techniques and approaches to art that I've always wanted to kind of dabble a little bit in each of them and see if I can master them and wrangle them to my own ends as much as possible. But if anything, my stuff tends towards a certain didacticism, I think, and a certain dynamism. I've always been very attracted to, for example, kind of Soviet kind of propaganda art, just for its propagandic nature, just for its ability to kind of force an idea on you through a dynamic image. But work that is also more subtle is also really appealing too. So I'm a little bit of a magpie stylistically, I would say.
Wow, that's an amazing response. So I'm going to kind of ask a question that doesn't get asked a lot in Canadian comic studies, but I hear a lot more conversations around African-American comics, Black comics and cartoonists, and Black Lives Matter in US comic studies. And I sometimes wonder if Canadians think it's impolite to talk about race. But there are very few Black Canadian cartoonists, and you're certainly at one of the sort of groundbreaking cartoonists depicting Black characters, Black lives, and Black political movements like the Civil Rights Movement. And so I asked Cole about, being an Indigenous cartoonist, and I actually want to ask you about being a Black cartoonist in Canada.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a lonely position, to be honest with you. When I started out, I couldn't really point to anybody in this country that I was aware of, at any rate, who was doing the kind of stuff that I was doing. And I didn't have an experience like Cole had, where I got to see, a Black person in a comic book, or know that, a person of color had created such work. The closest I got to that was the work of the Hernandez brothers, Mexican-American cartoonists producing work that was, very much about their culture in the 1980s in Los Angeles. And that stuff was a real revelation to me. So it's aside from the brilliance of their cartooning, just the fact that they were a voice outside of the norm, really galvanized me. It was actually mostly in cinema that I got to see representations, like myself, through the work of like Spike Lee, for example, Charles Burnett, John Singleton, the list goes on. So that was more energizing to me. I was able to sort of take that influence and put it into the work that I was doing in comic books at that time. That has changed, fortunately over the years. There are more kind of female voices and people of color who are doing their things, so I can actually look to them as examples. But when I was starting out, it was a lonely playing field. I can't lie.
Yeah, and I think that is changing slowly. And I'm going to do a plug for another Black Canadian comics artist some people may not know yet, and it's Stanley Waney from Montreal. And his new surrealist comic, Helen, just came out with Conundrum. And it's really, really interesting. And we're hoping to have more conversations with him in the special issue we're organizing. But to me, he's really a Montreal cartoonist, and you're such a Toronto cartoonist that it's really exciting to see more representations of Black characters and Black stories in Canadian comics. So I think, thanks so much for that kind of background. And I guess I first want to ask Cole and Hoche if they have questions for each other. I don't know if you've met before or talked before, but I'm going to let you ask each other questions if you have any. And if not, we'll start to open it up.
Not really. Cole, I just kind of discovered your work last night. I watched a couple interviews with you and checked out your stuff online. I thought it was really beautiful, but I'm not as familiar enough with it as I should be to have any questions, unfortunately.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, I've known your stuff for a while. I was introduced to your comics through King.
Right on.
And I really enjoyed your kayfabe interview that came out I guess a year and a half ago.
Yeah. Thanks, man. Yeah. Appreciate it.
I wanted to save this question to the end, but maybe I'll ask it now. Can you tell us about your the time you were an actor? You posted recently that you were like a detective in a short, right, or something like that.
Did you see my post about my action movie career? My 5-minute
action I want to know about it.
Yeah, that was when I was in film school. That was we shot that in 2012, something like that. And yeah, a friend of mine came up to me in the hallway, a guy I've worked with a lot before and continue to work with. And he said, "Hey man, I wrote this thing. I kind of had you in mind. Would you be interested in doing it?" I'm not an actor by any stretch of the imagination, but one thing I have to say is acting is a hell of a lot of fun. Once you get to be on a set and pretend for an entire stretch of time, and it's pretty appealing. And when somebody comes up to you and says, "Do you want to be like an assassin from the future? Do you want to dive around and shoot guns and be the cool guy for once in your life?" Yeah, that's kind of hard to turn down. So we spent a couple of weeks shooting that movie over weekends, and it was so much fun, man. It's just what I said. I got to pretend I was a blind assassin. I got to dive and shoot people and save the girl, and it was badass. Yeah, so I don't know that I'd want to make a career being an actor, but for the 2-3 weeks that we shot that film, it was pretty good. The only problem with it though is that I was in my mind, I'd been that person for so long that I was taking him home. I'd be walking down the street pretending that I could kick your ass. Can't kick your ass. But,
your method acting on the bus.
Yeah, man, don't mess with me, man. Because you were going down, except probably not.
Your description makes me want to watch it, but I'm scared to try to convince that out of you in front of everyone. And
I'll send you a link. No, that's not a problem. I'll send that to you easy.
Cole, since you've asked about Hoche's acting career, I want to ask you about dancing, because I have heard you talk about the name of the Dakwakata Warriors comes from a dancing group in your community, right?
Yeah. So I named my book after the Dakwakata Dancers, which is a traditional song and dance group from my hometown. I was a member for the first 17 years of my life. And then I became an angsty teenager and went off to do other, teenager things. But yeah, there's a page in the third issue of Dakwakata Warriors where I did a portrait of an elder, and her name's Annie Ned. And she's a very highly prestigious elder from my home community. And I believe she passed away in 1990 or 1991. So I never met her, but she founded the Dakwakata Dancers, And in my book, I made it so she founded the Dakota Warriors as well. And I had to ask her family members to get permission. And then I also had to ask my band, Championajak First Nation, to have archive access to get photos of her to illustrate her. And yeah, it's the Dakota dancers are still around. They still perform. My parents are still members. My sisters are members. Kashaw, one of my language preservers that I was talking about at the beginning of this, he's a member. And you can see that all in the back of my book. I drew like an 8-page, it's kind of like a bonus DVD feature, but like for a comic, and I kind of dissect why I did things and the reasons for everything in my book, really.
Actually, Cole, I had a quick question for you. I was curious because I read an interview where you said that initially you were just asking your collaborators to translate words for you, and then after a while you realized it was better for you to just give them the entire script to translate. So were you like picking and choosing the words that you wanted to translate once you got back their full translation, or how did that work out?
I was just using their full translation at that point because, yeah, the first issue, I gave them like a list of like 30 words, and I was like, please get this translated. And they're like, we can't really do it that way. We need the full sentences so we can have like a better understanding of what you want out of us. And I was like, okay, sure. So the second and third issue, I straight up gave them the entire script, and then whatever they translated, I kept in the book. And then like there's two dialects of Southern Shoshone, the Champagne dialect and the Ajax dialect. And the original issues have both. And traditionally you could speak like the separate dialects to each other and still have a pretty good understanding of what you were saying to each other. But the collection, I re-edited all the Southern Shoshone to just be the Ajax dialect. And Kashaw Kashaw did the editing, and then he sent me a huge email that was like the whole book edited, and I had to go through each word one by one to make sure it was spelt the right way.
Oh my God.
I had that problem where like I handwrite all my text on my comic pages. So when I had to re-spell words, I erased like a bunch of the background because there was no background behind that text, right? So I had to like redraw and patch the backgrounds for so long, and that was my whole winter 2 years ago, or like 3 years ago when I was editing the book. So yeah, a lot of effort goes into the editing for the Southern Shoshone.
It sounds like it. Sounds like it. Any Hernandez brothers influence? Just because of the punk connection, I was curious about that.
You know what? I'm gonna like lose all my punk credibility. I've never read Hernandez brothers comic.
Don't just stop right there.
Yeah, I know how sacrilegious it is because like I'm good friends with Robin McConnell, who's the president of VanCaf, and he's like the hugest Hernandez brothers fan. So when I told him that, he was like, you're coming over and borrowing like 10 books and you're gonna read them like
correct
all through.
That was the right response.
Yeah, I know my mistake and I'm willing to change it.
Fair enough. You're forgiven.
Thanks for that. We have some questions coming up in the chat, but I just have one more question. And I'm sorry, Hoche, to focus on King. I know that you've published many other things, but okay. Listening to Cole talk about putting real people in his comics and needing permission and using reference images and archives, I just would like to hear from both of you about that line between historical so-called fact and then invention and creativity in fiction. Because in King, I'm pretty sure you invent a female character to be there with the male leadership, which seems to me a kind of feminist gesture to say, well, women were part of it too, although the conventional ways that story is told, it's very much a masculine movement. But my bigger question is about like, where do you see your responsibility to telling historical stories or depicting real people versus your artistic license to kind of take off from that?
Right. Well, I'll tell you, I don't know that I'd make that choice today. I think today I would probably, because what I was trying to do is I was trying to as you said, it was such a male-dominated movement. Or let's put it this way: the people who got the most coverage were the men, but so much of the work that was done behind the scenes was by the women. And so, with lacking like a really recognizable female lead, kind of stand toe to toe with the guys on a day-to-day basis. I thought, why don't I just composite a bunch of different people and then create somebody who can like be with them, on the day-to-day. But I think, and that worked out just fine for that time period. But I think if I were to do that now, if I were to tackle that book now, I don't know how I would handle that. I would probably just have more female characters who were sort of there for a few pages and, probably gone, and there for another few pages, and, somebody else is here and there. But I don't know that I necessarily would have had it be a composite character. I would just made it a series of real people now. So.
And I know, Cole, your Dakota Warriors has gone back to the community, and I assume that the elders you consulted and the people you depict and your family members have all read it. So, Hoche, have you heard from the King family at all? Have you had any feedback from them about that book?
Initially, originally it was published in 3 volumes, and when the first volume came out, we heard from their estate. They were none too pleased. I think because I was not trying to do hagiography. I was trying to be, just a little bit more, just objective about who this person was. And that's not, families don't always want you to be honest about the flaws of the person that you're doing a biography about. They often prefer you to just, paint a rosy picture, which I can understand, but that's not the game I was playing. So they were not too happy with us. They asked us to cease and desist. We were kind of punk rock ourselves back then. Said, screw you. No, we're just going to do what we have to do. At that time, I was not concerned about lawsuits and, legal ramifications of any kind. And my publisher followed suit. We're a little older, a little more conservative today. Maybe we might be a little bit more concerned about that, but I suspect not. The truth needs to be told. And if you have to suffer a few slings and arrows in the process, then, maybe it's worth it.
Yeah, and thanks for that, because you've also kind of answered my question about how things have changed for you over your career in the industry as comics have become more mainstream. And we have some questions in the chat, which everyone can read along, and I'm just going to read them out. There's one really interesting one that goes back to you both having kind of performance careers, I guess, in quotes, acting and dancing. But Irene's asking, she says, the depiction of bodies in comics can be and have been contentious and problematic, especially depictions of non-dominant identities. But as Cole was talking about Indigenous heritage values, how Indigenous heritage values oral storytelling, but it also values kinetic storytelling through dancing and movement. So I'm wondering how comics can and does include bodies as their own powerful transmission of story by including oral and kinetic traditions, or perhaps disrupting the historical colonialization of bodies. That is an amazingly intense question.
That is.
Can I throw it to one of you?
I'm not sure I have the intellectual capacity to answer such a brilliant question. Cole, I'm going to let you handle this one, buddy.
Yeah, man, that's such a meaty question. No pun intended about bodies. Well, I got to think about my bodies. Well, okay, I'm going to go back to kind of what your question was about real people in comics. And like to have Annie Ned in my book, it was a big deal. I had to ask both sides of the family, both the most, like the eldest living relatives on both of her sides. And then I had to go through Champagne Ajax to get the archive photos. And before they even allowed me, they asked me if I had permission from the family to look at these, because they were like, it's family photos. And, I proved it. I was like, yes, I have Mary Jane and Diane's approval. And they were like, okay, yeah, you asked the right people. So here's access to it. And, to draw her, it's like my friend's grandma, it's my best friend's mom's mom. So there's like a level of like, don't fuck this up in me, drawing her and including her. Cause it was like, okay, I have her approval. I have the family's approval. Now I have to execute the portrait appropriately to like the, you know, the same like stature that her family holds her up to. So that was like kind of intimidating, but like Pizza Punks, I drew tons of real people in that book, and some of it was kind of like fan bootleg comics, and other, like eventually the 5th issue, I drew a licensed Dumb comic about my friend's band Dumb, and I had to draw the whole band, and I've known them for like a decade. And I found that more intimidating actually, because I see them every day and I know what their faces look like, and I know I messed up like on the nose, or I messed up on like how wide the face is, and like there's all these like small mistakes that I see because I know the person very well, and I know that like they're gonna see it immediately, and it's gonna be like for their band, and it's gonna be published by their label and throughout the whole world. So like drawing that Dumb comic, I found way more stressful than drawing Annie Ned. But I think that's just like for personal reasons.
Yes.
I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah, drawing people in comics is very hard sometimes. But it's also, I kind of find it nice because I can just turn off like my creativity switch, and I can just look at something and try and execute the portrait or execute the illustration of like whatever photo I'm drawing.
Right.
So that's kind of nice, like I just drew my 3rd cover for my next book, and I drew it based off a photo I took in the Yukon. And it was honestly really nice to just like not think about the composition or the coloring or anything, because the photo is already taken and the photo has everything. It's all there already. So I was just like, oh, I can just turn off my brain and do this like mechanical side, or I just like pulled it out of my butt, and it felt like it was less effort than actually coming up with a whole concept and being super creative about it. And it's like pretty different than my other covers too, so I still feel like happy with it.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Cole. OJ, I'm going to just pick up on the end of Irene's question, because when I teach your comics, a lot of my...
Who asked that question? Of course, that was one of her questions. All right.
But when I teach your comics, my students are really interested in how to read your comics in the tradition of racist comics that depict and caricature Black bodies. And I think the end of the question is about disrupting the historical colonialization of bodies. I think it's a question about representation, right? So, it's always so challenging, I think, for cartoonists working within what has historically been a racist tradition and depiction of bodies of people of color. So how do you approach that?
Yeah, it's tricky, and it's funny. I just wrote a graphic novel called The Resurrectionists, which takes place in late 1860s in New York City, and it's at the height of the minstrel era, essentially, which is like one of the first like mainstream pop cultural phenomena North America had. And it was fascinating for me in researching that book to really dive into. I mean, it's not that these images were news to me in any way, but it's one thing to be familiar with something, and it's something else to dive into something and get a concentrated dose of it. And after several days of researching minstrel shows and blackface and those balloon lips and throwing, having Black men in carnival settings where you'd throw iron balls at them and to dunk them into water and pretend hangings and Punch and Judy shows and all this stuff. It was kind of messed with my mind a little bit, and I was always sensitive to seeing depictions of not just Black people but other cultures depicted in the past, where you'd get like during wartime comics, you'd get these grotesque depictions of Japanese people with these massive buck teeth and just a little line for an eye. That stuff it's pretty offensive, but at the same time there is a tradition in comic books of caricature, and every race, every culture, no culture should be excluded from from that tradition just because it could potentially cause offense. So there's a fine line to draw between caricaturing somebody and doing it with respect, and just straight up making somebody look like a fool. I don't always know where that line is. All I can say is that as a Black cartoonist, if I want to take a little bit of license with a Black character, I feel empowered to do that. Would I feel so empowered to do that with a First Nations character? Less so. So yeah, I don't. Everybody has to walk that line. Walk their own version of that line, let's say.
Thanks. And, we've seen those brutal images, and sometimes I think it's important to see that history and then to contend
100%.
with it.
Yeah,
Sorry,
please.
I just put a link in the chat to an amazing award-winning scholarly book by a colleague in U.S. Comic Studies, Rebecca Wanzo, and it's called The Content of Our Caricature, and it's about the representation of African Americans in comics. It's a brilliant book that argues that some African American cartoonists reclaimed those images in really interesting ways. So it's not as simple as it might seem.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one thing that I hate is the idea of removing stuff from history because it is offensive. Clearly there's a big debate going on down in the States right now about whether slavery should be taught in schools, which is so deeply offensive and frustrating and baffling to me. Just the thought that, you get this. You understand what I'm saying. It's just removing history from our education is highly problematic and dangerous.
Absolutely. Can I ask when your graphic novel might come out and who's publishing it?
Yeah, it's going to be published by an imprint of Abrams Comic Arts called Megascope. I'm about to do a second draft of it in about 2 weeks, and then it goes to the artist, Jeremy Love. So that's kind of up to him. He's probably got about 1.5 years of drawing ahead of him, and then about 6 months of promotion. So probably a couple of years from now. Okay. But it's I'm super duper excited about it. I think it's going to be pretty good.
Yeah, I am too. And I feel like we've heard it here first. There are some specific questions for each of you, but I just want to kind of build on what you've been saying and ask a general question from Julie Rack that I have a feeling will go straight to what you want to talk about as artists. And Julie's asking, can I ask about your process of drawing? What kind of pens and paper do you use? Do you do computer editing? And how do you deal with color? So this is a real nuts and bolts question. And maybe I'll ask Cole to start.
Sure. I just use microns. And I just use like a thick cardstock. I'm like really cheap with my paper. If I need a larger drawing, sure, I'll buy like Bristol board or something like that, or maybe I'll use like my latest cover I drew on Stonehenge just because it's like 2 feet by 1.5 feet, so it's just like one large sheet, and I was like, you know what, I'll use this. But I'm not very picky about it. Like a lot of my drawings are on like printer paper, but like thick cardstock printer paper, just because I like how smooth it is. And it's also like super cheap for like a huge stack of it, and it lasts me forever. And for coloring, I draw everything black and white, and then I'll color it on Photoshop. And I'm pretty, selective with my colors, usually just 2 or 3 at most. So I kind of just fool around with what I think it looks best, or sometimes like a comic will have a color concept in mind. So like the root and stem comic I drew about Turok and Indigenous representation in video games, I colored that like 3 shades of green. And everyone was like, why would you color it like these colors? And I was like, it's a Game Boy screen. Like I'm referencing like the Game Boy. And they were like, oh, that makes sense. A comic about video games is the color of like a video game screen, So that's kind of like my logic for all of my stuff. Like Dakota Warriors, I was like black, white, and red. It's the traditional colors of my nation. So I'm going to go with that. And Pizza Punks, I deliberately printed it on orange paper because I wanted it to look like a punk flyer or look like a block of cheese, like it maybe like choosing that one color, I have so much intention with it, you know? And maybe that's why I don't need the other colors.
I love it. Okay, so me, I guess. I'm totally analog, and I'm also totally digital. For example, right now I'm finishing off the last 50 pages of my comic book Godhead. I still draw my comics on, traditional board. It's a thick piece of watercolor paper. I've drawn on everything from printer paper to, watercolor paper to masonite to canvas, whatever. But as I've gotten older, I've decided I kind of like the luxury of having a nice, thick, beefy piece of paper to work on. So I do that, and I still use the traditional methods. Blue pencil, occasional micron. Really looking for my. Here we go. Got like a Hunt 107 on a crow quill here. Brushes, mechanical pencil, all that kind of stuff. Real traditional nuts and bolts stuff for drawing. For painting, I like to mostly use acrylics, although lately it's been more oils than anything else. It's because I kind of like the classic feel of oil painting, and there's a certain kind of romance and ease of blending, and a kind of a luminosity that you get from oil painting that is less achievable in acrylics. So yeah, those are my methods, man. Pretty standard, but I also really like to scan stuff into the computer and, color my comics, for example, either in Procreate on the iPad or in Photoshop. It's traditional stuff. Well, I guess traditional and more newer techniques.
We have about 3 minutes left. Is it okay with both of you if we go for about another 10 minutes? Because there's some quite specific questions. Is
Sure.
that okay?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, awesome. And I will point out that Andrew O'Malley is very glad to hear Godhead Volume 2 is almost done. And Chris Rains Chikuma in Edmonton said that they're very excited about your exhibit at the Alberta Gallery of Art. So there's a big community waiting for you there. Since you mentioned Godhead, there's a question from Anna Savard in the chat on that. And she says the color gallery at the end of Godhead mentions that there was a decision to move towards a black and white style over the more painterly style included in the color pages. In your talk, you mentioned your restless approach to comic style. Since these styles are starkly different in their technique, I'm curious what motivated the decision to settle on the style you did and how you feel it serves the narrative of Godhead.
Oh, wow. Fascinating question. Well, okay. So one of the many influences and inspirations for Godhead was I'm passionate about an artist named Ralph McQuarrie. He was best known for he's a production artist for Star Wars, and a phenomenal paperback illustrator, book illustrator, and designer, and the guy's amazing. And so one of my early influences was movie production art, specifically McQuarrie art. So when I started on Godhead, I really wanted to apply that style to the finished art. The problem is, when I started that book, I was doing it without the support of a publisher. And this was before Kickstarter, this was before anything like that. And I tried to sell it at Marvel and DC. They weren't interested. I think I could make a case for it today, but at the time they were not buying what I was selling. So I didn't have the kind of financial support that I would have needed to put the time into producing those pages, because it was a fairly laborious process. I wish I had an original piece right now to show you. They're at another location right now, but I was originally doing them on like 18 by 24 size pieces of masonite. I would have to draw the stuff on a piece of newsprint, transfer that to a piece of gessoed masonite, and then take like 3 days essentially to draw and paint the entire page. It was taking me upwards of a week to do a page. When you're doing a 300-page comic, that's ridiculous, especially if you don't have the financial resources that I needed at the time. So at a certain point, I decided, even though nobody wanted to publish the book, that I was going to do it anyway. And I just started. But I knew that I couldn't do this elaborate painted style as much as it meant to me. So I had to switch to black and white just so I could crank those pages out at a reasonable clip. And I kind of like the kind of immediacy that you get from black and white art. So it was kind of exciting to switch back to it. But I have to admit, there's a part of me that mourns what it could have been. It would have been a really kind of elaborate and ambitious project. And yeah, dreams come, they go. You know, God, what's the phrase? Man plans, God laughs, something like that. Anyway.
Thanks. And I think you've given us a bit of an insight into the kinds of economic pressures that cartoonists are under. Ivan has his hand up, so I'm going to jump to him next.
Thanks, Anna. Hello, Hoche and Cole.
Yeah.
Thanks for this delicious presentation. It's just riveting. Questions to both of you. Cole, you come from an oral tradition, and the repositories of your stories are living people. Now, how do you think somebody coming from an oral tradition would respond to having their work go into an archive? The work you produce is actually frozen in a way. Could it belong in an archive? And Hoche, I know you've donated your King material, original material, to the Billy Ireland, and you're working to get some of your stuff into the McMaster archives. I'd like to ask you, how do you think digital stuff should be preserved? Because there's so much coming out now digitally. This question connects with yesterday a bit about the past, but it's also about the future. We want to make sure that your work is around for the future for people to look at and study, and the originals. So both questions to you, Cole. How do you feel about archiving your work eventually? And are you thinking you're a young person right now, but are you thinking about it in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of already started it. A year ago, I spilt milk on my computer, and I killed my computer, and I didn't have $3,000 to buy a new computer. So for the first time ever, I sold originals from Dakota Warriors. And when I made the announcement, I had like a lineup waiting for me. It was great, you know, like within one day, I made that $3,000. It was perfect. I was like, this is more than what I ever wanted, you know, like I was gonna buy a used computer, but I was able to buy a brand new one with how many sales I made. And then I kind of like closed the vault again. But I contacted the Yukon Permanent Art Collection when I broke my computer, and I was like, just so you know, I'm gonna like start selling pages, and if you want pages, let me know. And they contacted me back, and they were like, yeah, we do. So I pitched them a bunch of pages, and I offered them like really choice ones, like the cover of the collection, and like the first page of the first issue, and like a 2-page spread. And yeah, they bought 5 pieces from me. So the Yukon Permanent Art Collection has like some of my favorite Dakota Warriors pages. And I probably wouldn't have sold the cover to like many other people, because I don't really want it to be hidden in like a private collection to be shown once every 40 years or whatever, you know, like I wanted it to be accessible to the public, and also to know that like whoever I sold it to won't sell it when I die, you know, like it'll stay within the permanent art collection forever. So I'm really happy I did that. And you know, I know a lot of libraries and a lot of archives have my book, or they have the zines. So I do know that like my book will probably outlive me, which is what I wanted, you know, like when I signed with Conundrum, I told Andy, I was like, I want my book to be in print. Like I want it to stay in print. I don't want it to have one print run and get sold out within 2 years, and then within 5 years, you know, the book's like $50 on eBay or something. I was like, I want this to be super accessible, and I want it, you know, I want it to be cheap too. And Andy was very like accepting of that, and he was like, yeah, of course, I want it to be the exact same. And I know it's been doing very well. Like my book's like on its like 4th printing right now. The front cover says first print still, because I hand wrote everything, and Andy doesn't want to like change it. So it doesn't like, so the font matches still, but yeah, my book's like on its 4th printing, so it's doing good.
You can Photoshop a 4th printing onto that thing, man, with your lettering. Just saying.
Yeah, I thought about that. I have the file on my computer. I've been meaning to edit it and send it to him, but I haven't done it yet.
You
Fair.
know, Cole, you know Andy is here right now. Just so you know, he's in the room. Hi, Andy. Jose, can you talk about archiving your work a bit?
Yeah, it's something I've really come around to. It's not something I had given any thought to at the beginning of my career. I don't know that it was, I don't really know that it was something that was done when I was starting out in 1990. All right. I don't think people were too interested in archiving funny books back then. That's something I think is more of a recent invention. So my focus for the first however long was just in selling that stuff. And I would sell maybe a third of whatever book I was working on, and or I'd published, and retain the rest. And I've never thrown anything out, so I've always had like a ginormous personal archive. But I was sort of like the idea of having my art out in the wild. There were so many artists that I loved and respected that I would have killed to have had a piece of original art that I could have hung of theirs up on my wall and admired on the daily. So, in my fantasy of fantasies, there was somebody out there who responded to my work in a similar fashion, and I loved the idea of my stuff reaching that person. But what Cole said kind of resonates with me, because I also, as I've gotten older, I really like the idea that that a student can go to an archive or a museum or whatever, and find the stuff and review it if they so desire. That it's there for study and for educational purposes. That is really kind of exciting to me. And that it's not just one person. Like, I don't care if this stuff, if a collector were to buy my work and then sell it again down the road, whatever, that's life. But I that's not the issue for me. But I do like the fact that so many people would have access to it, and that it would have a chance to have a life beyond me. That the original art would not just go into a landfill or wherever. It would actually can reach a significant amount of people. So I really it's something that's become kind of increasingly important to me, and something that I'm hoping to archive everything I've got eventually. And I've got a ton of stuff, so it'll be pretty substantial.
Thanks. I think I can probably speak for Ivan and say we're super glad to hear that you both want your archives to be in the public domain. It always feels kind of ghoulish to me to ask an artist, what are you going to do with your archives? Because, we're thinking about after you're gone, but I think it's super important. Although I can imagine that on the day-to-day, you can't really go down to the basement and organize all the files. But we really hope one of the goals of the symposium is to think about ways that we can network all the different collections across the country of Canadian cartoonists' archives and make them accessible for students and fans and readers. And there's lots of great response to both your answers in the chat. We're almost out of time, but there was quite a specific question for Cole from Chris Rains Chikuma, because you mentioned the manga influence. And I know some of us are thinking not just about cartoonists working in Canada, but the kinds of comics that are circulating widely amongst Canadian comics fans. And of course, manga is a big part of that we haven't really tracked sufficiently. So Chris is asking you about the manga influence, and if you can elaborate on that a bit. And do you see it, like Yakalana's, as a way to counter American and Anglo imperialism or dominance of the comics market? Or is it more an aesthetic thing for you, like the speed lines and the style?
Yeah. Okay. Influences. Teo Matsumoto is probably one of my favorite mangakas ever. Most famous for Tekkon Kinkreet.
I love that book, man.
Yeah, his stuff's really good. My favorite of his though is Sunny, which is like the most like gut-wrenching comic you'll ever read. And I learned it's like based on true stories, which is, I guess, because Teo Matsumoto was he was adopted, or given up for adoption, I should say, and he lived in foster care when he was a child. And it's about the Star children who live in the Star House. That's like the name of their foster care home. And yeah, it's like each volume's like the backstory of 6 different kids and like the reason why they're in this orphanage. And it's like the saddest comic you'll ever read. And like the most saddest story in the whole series is Teo Matsumoto's story, I learned, which is it's very sad. Um, but it's so good. But I have, like, my mom was adopted. I have 2 adopted sisters. Um, so although I'm not adopted, the adoption process has been in my life a lot. So reading that and seeing I don't know, it was just like, it fucked me up in like all the right ways, it's such a good book. And yeah, it's only 6 volumes. That's like something that has kind of like pushed me away from manga, is like someone will be like, you should read this series, it's 200 volumes, and I'm like, I do not have the time for that. But this series is 6 volumes, so like an hour each, and it's like 6 hours of your life. It's worth it. But yeah, I think it's the storytelling that gets me so interested in manga, just because the pacing is so different from American comics. And again, yeah, like the coloring is super unique to manga, like when you think manga, you think of like phone book sized magazines full of colorful pages. um and I'm actually like kind of using that as reference for my next book. I'm trying not to have any black and white pages in my next book. I'm gonna have it all spot color with like colored background pages, and then like the line work will be, it'll be like a light blue on a dark blue or whatever. So like Shonen Jump magazines are like really influential on me right now, just like aesthetically, something about like just looks like candy to me. So I'm trying to like make my comics look like candy as well.
Are you going
And for
beyond
the Michael,
just 2 colors?
pardon me?
Are you going just beyond the 2 colors on this next one, or is it still going to be a 2-color?
Yeah, I'm gonna go all over the place. It's mostly gonna be spot color still, but I'm gonna be using more than just black, white, and red.
Cool.
um, and yeah, the Michael Yagalanis question. I mean, just look at his art. Like it's so captivating, like that's what gripped me. Was I was like, oh, this is beautiful form line, but he's also like able to twist and turn it and bend it and shape it into any figure or shape he wants, and like that's the mark of like a true master artist, is that you can like reinvent the wheel. And that's what Michael Nicole Yagalanis does with like every book he has. It's like unreal. Like, I don't know, he's like a very unique brain, especially in the comics world, alone in like the art world. um so yeah, aesthetically for sure, and then subject matter second, because I will follow him wherever he goes.
Thanks so much, Cole. And Zach's put the link to Sunny by Matsumoto in the chat. It sounds amazing. I'm going to give the last word to you, Ho-Che, because it seems like you read manga too, and I think it's a good way to get beyond the borders of Canadian comics and think about other influences. So, are you a manga fan, and do you share Cole's kind of interest in it?
You know what? I'm not a huge manga fan. I've always been curious about it, and what little of it I've come across, I've enjoyed, but I'm not a huge manga guy. But I am familiar with Tekken Kinkreet. I just picked it up randomly. I saw the cover. I thought it looked great. Picked it up and absolutely fell in love with it. I've been wanting to read more of the, what is the artist's name again? The writer artist's name again?
Teo
Matsumoto?
Matsumoto?
Yeah.
Sorry?
Michael Nikolakalanis, the Haida manga artist?
No, the Tekken Kinkreet guy.
Okay.
Although the other artist you mentioned sounds fascinating as well. But no, I've wanted to check out more of his work, but I just haven't gotten around to it. Manga's always been a blind spot for me. So it's an interest, but it's a blind spot.
Yeah, I feel the same way, and it's hard to know where to start, but I'm going to start with Sunny. So then I will ask you, because we have some great recommendations from Cole that we will put out in our resources document we're going to send out. What comic would you recommend to everyone, Ho-Che, that people read, if not your own?
Oh, wow. Oh, man. Oh, gosh, you're killing me here. Off the top of my head, I'm really digging Ed Piskor's Red Room at the moment. That is definitely not for everybody. It's pretty intense, but if you want some kind of outlaw art, you could check out Ed Piskor's Red Room for Fantagraphics books.
A very academic title.
Is it?
Okay, we're going to wrap out because we need to get going with the next session and getting people into that Zoom room. I want to thank you both so much. It's just, you're so generous with your time and your expertise. And I'm going to use Ivan's word. This was a delicious conversation. We're so happy to have you join us. We're going to try and follow up with both of you to get something into that journal issue we have coming out. And of course, we're all going to follow up with your forthcoming works. So thank you again so much. And we hope you can stick around. If not, we're going to be posting all the other sessions to YouTube, including this recording, so people can catch up. And just for everyone who's in the next session, I'm posting the link. That's going to be a fantastic roundtable chaired by the aforementioned Andy Brown of Conundrum Press, with publishers from Canadian comics presses, talking about what they do and what we need to do. So once again, thank you to both of you and to everyone who came out today, and we'll see you in about 14 minutes in the publishing roundtable. Thanks again. And the check is in the mail.
Yes, that's what I want to hear.